Chilly here with Sirius, Taurus, Moon, Jupiter, our Venus day. And Venus is in Cancer, 5 degrees separating from the square to Neptune. Moon is 28 degrees Scorpio, separating from the opposition to Mars. So, ascendants very close to the galactic center. Jupiter on a retic degree, Cancer. Venus in Leo ruling the midheaven. Well, the annual square of the Sun and Neptune is almost completely behind us. Now, this is a very challenging one. Sun is the father. It also is the leader. It also is our confidence, radiance, and shine. The personality, the heart health. Neptune is the higher octave of Venus, but is also requiring some sort of unconditional love to bring its curation quality. Now, here's the thing: when Sun and Neptune agree, when they are in harmony, we can have a prolonged agreement between the character of a relation and the frequency of unconditional love, and we'd have to ask ourselves how much of it is, and that depending on many other factors, is in favor of the nature of the relation, and how much no. For example, we could unconditionally love our father even though he didn't know about willing consent. But we can say, oh, people in past generations didn't have a Me Too. They didn't have these discussions, and they were used to, and there were things happening in secrecy to boys as well. As long as we do not let that be a reason that we honor ourselves less, our radiance, our shine, our confidence, our personality, our health, then we can say that we discontinue the bad traits and appreciate the good traits. Alternatively, we can have a disagreement, a hard aspect between the Sun and Neptune. Well, Neptune requires for unconditional love, the Sun coming in friction with Neptune can create an ideation devaluation crisis. Sun, when is going through the ego death or ego dissolution, can show the what people call the egotistic to narcissistic traits. For example, fathers that threaten children that they would be harmed or violated or subjected to, boys or girls are subjected to, let's say, sexual boundary violation or whatnot, if they don't do that, and that, are basically narcissistic, abusive fathers. In fact, Neptune the facet of Neptune that is an intergenerational planet kind of asks to abolish rape culture. One of the things, now, there is also health, and Sun in Cancer can be fertility. One of the things I saw is how the pedophilia is marketed as growing population, ignoring the fact that it grows neurodegenerative diseases, DNA mutations, and children that are susceptible to influences that would call them, let's say, to kill their parents. This is what brought us, in fact, the patrilineages, where brothers would fight and the father would fear his son. Okay, and Sun is about to square Saturn. Okay, when we think about Saturn in Mars sign, we think about father-son relations and how Saturn was figuratively eating his children because he was afraid that they will outthrow him. That only happens when the sexuality is not willingly consensual. Would we hear such myths in societies that are funded over equal rights or matrilineages, or the type of societies that did not accept, for example, the patriarchal indoctrination? The church is just the best example. Probably we also have Islam, but the church is kind of like the best example for that. And because, yeah, okay, so it's kind of like it's not against Christianity, it's just about Christianity being a patriarchal structure, and that has a pros and cons. This is, I guess, why they talk about the second coming of Christ as a black woman. Now, what is the market value, which is also Neptune, of marketing neurodegenerative diseases under the guise of making pedophilia alluring or normalized? Well, I made an earlier episode that talks about the uptick in this gene mutation, that gene mutation, and this is not about, oh, the parents were, not necessarily, we're not talking about one generation back, we're talking about a heritage, and that can mean that along the ancestry, were there people that, did the tribes that comprise the bloodline have weddings at puberty? Now, the market value of such diseases is raising a shit ton of funds, and my prediction was already that until how should I say that, the medications that are found cause inflammation as well, and inflammation is the core of the disease there. The symptoms are basically symptoms that are by inflammation. Um, and until we basically practice practices that honor the sense of self, then we won't have actual remedies without horrifying and an unspoken side effect. Um, but just standing to that core thing, I believe, can remediate that. First of all, it can assist in the discernment between what can actually help and what is marketed as something that helps. Um, and it can also prevent cases where something helps and the funding is abrupted, as was in cures for cancer. Um, so, Sun square Neptune definitely brought some ego dissolution. Definitely brought some clash between the frequency of unconditional love and the radiance and shine. Um, and in the background, we have Chiron applying to square Pluto. Now, sun, personal planets to other planets can also be intergenerational tensions. Um, and these are the type, and particularly with Sun in Cancer, Moon in Scorpio, opposing Mars. There can be a Moon Mars friction, and the emotional needs of radiance and shine might not be so effectively meeting. And then, let's say, fathers could be feeling unappreciated, while sons or daughters could be feeling unloved or unappreciated, or that they are required to do things that are unloving to themselves to be seen as something that the father would be proud of or would be approving of, or at least would not be dismissive of. And that is intense abuse, but it also traces back to the fact that these fathers were abused in those ways. Okay, Moon, Sun, Neptune aspects are to do with the patrilineage, and Venus is the highest octave, and Neptune is the highest higher octave of Venus. So it tells us of relations. At the lower frequency, it can be a Venusian relations between father and son. And that means when the sun is seen as the feminine, and that can stir up even to dissociation things that are profoundly challenging. And they can show up in father-son relation, father-daughter relation. Um, Ketu Magha on degree 2 emphasizes the relations and the hereditary. Neptune can be both disease, but also medicine, drugs, lineages that had to do with that. I think about, for example, Terence McKenna and how he discovered that MDMA um, was both facilitating curation from trauma, but also, if practiced in the wrong environment, removes the otherwise barriers that for people to sleep with people, even if those other people are children. So environments where drugs were a part of, very addictive drugs, and how they affected relations, hereditary relations, and so on. The wealth of nations being built on um, Then there is also the Terence McKenna that taught people that the use of psychedelics is about using enough, having enough dose to not have a bad trip, basically having more than what people think, but that the trip begins in the library for quite prolonged duration, and it would also accentuate a way that's not compatible, while he himself died from something to do with neural issue that we don't know if was related to the drugs, or whether drugs were needed to alleviate certain traumas that affected the brain, or all of the above. Now, um, so there is also Saturn Aries in the background. Okay, the Sun is applying to square Saturn, and I think the awareness of our emotional need for unconditional love and appreciation, and how Sun in Cancer emphasizes the emotional aspect of the solar figures, so it's leaders, fathers, and and accentuates on the clash between the availability of unconditional love, or the need for unconditional love, as preceding, unfortunately, the ability of the father to be nurturing, but also preceding, how should I say it? It's not about the child making the father proud, it's about the father being proud that enables the child to be radiant and shiny, particularly when you have Cancer placements that accentuate on the nourishment. This is the 12th from Leo, so the sun is in its blind spot. Um, and now the trine will actually be from Leo. So a lot of the difficulties, the egoic related things, and even the emotionally overwhelming, challenging things, when we talk about lineages discontinuation due to these genetic issues that were formed in lineages where there was wedding at puberty, that caused both mothers to not be able to mother, but also fathers not being able to to father in a way that would defend the child, son or daughter, from um, somewhat emotionally unfulfilling, or not, how should I say that, yeah, somewhat emotionally unfulfilling relations, whether it's gay or straight relations. um, and then we think about the practical notions of the father versus the emotional ones, and how basically the emphasis on whether it's the will and consent, the spirit and matter, the vocation, okay, the fact that there would not even be a threat that somebody would be harmed because, let's say, they have a disability, or um, and the environment, uh, and that of course creates sense of self related issues, and on an intergenerational level, neurodegenerative diseases for both women and men. Um, Neptune, of course, is also eroticism, which is profoundly, particularly when we talk about the appeal of, or the erotization of, something that in reality was never, was way more traumatic to probably everyone. And um, the attempts to curate or to heal uh, there's a clash between the personal nourishment needs and the societal or the state of society that still needs to literally recover the sense of self and the I am in the face of those trajectories or societal origin related, and but also origin dissolving. Okay, literally lineages discontinuations, or where it becomes the question of not wanting to transmit by genetics being the thing that stops procreation, rather than the discontinuation of whether it's weddings at puberty or malnourishing emotional relations. Neptune is the missing and is eroticism and longing at the same time. There's a clash between, for example, the missing or the longing for a father, and issues that could be of erotization that could have been related to that. And those can appear actually in the crisis of growth. The square, the opening square, is the growth crisis. People are growing out of those patterns, at least to some degree. And unfortunately, it's usually a process of seeing of the mythical being kind of like when people approach the mythical, they see the traumatic more. It's kind of like approaching the horizon, but seeing the actual reality of the horizon, or the actual um, and then the view of how should I say that, the encounter with the traumatic that can cause dissociation, but it can also cause how should I say that, um, it, it, well, it can cause a quest to meet the emotional, particularly with Sun in Cancer, the emotional, not through the erotic or sexual so much, but through embodiment and spirit matter embodiment. And then there is this nature of, like, the purgative nature of Scorpio, and the quest of the last decan of Taurus, that is basically understanding that wealth, confidence, radiance, shine do not come with sexual boundary violation in spirit or in matter. And here the frictions can be paramount, particularly when we have such normalization or over marketing of trying to normalize the abnormal, again because there's a banking to both deciding the gender of the fetus, but also every, when you think about genetic mutation and each gene mutation requiring a different type of intervention, we see that that that's a banking. And unfortunately, as long as it's being treated that way, and I believe all the way to the 2060s, where we're going to have the Pluto and Neptune square, we're going to see the dissolution of, or the need to allocate resources to research, or to allocate or to curate holistically cultural patterns in order to, in addition to any intervention, because seeing everything as market value and just manipulating the market to agree with, let's say, ecosystem, doesn't in itself solve the entire equation. Probably Chiron in Taurus squaring Pluto will be addressing that as well, and this is something that is affecting all of us. For example, my mother just bought cucumbers, and they were looking fair and lovely at the store. Then they became yellow by the time when I was going to eat them. That's that's a degenerative disease of vegetables that were absolutely not organic, showing us how even the food industry, the soil health, um, the need for food to be accessible, or the financial responsibility to buy something, um, whether at a fair price or for something that looks good at a fair price, and how those things can be suddenly the fixed thing of Taurus can be somewhat eroded, and then suddenly the tomatoes were had a little almost foam on them, and I said, no, we cannot eat half of the tomatoes. We actually have to throw all of them because they affect the entire food. And that's a very Taurus. Yeah, it's a very Chiron square Pluto. Um, and then, of course, there are the good looking, absolutely not organic stuff that might imitate food, but they grow all types of anomalies in cell. Now, though that's simply Chiron being in Taurus, squaring Pluto. Pluto is that decay, the compost, and in Saturn sign, the real reality is like, no, that is a nervous system. Even what is not yet visible is affected, and that in itself can affect the fifth vital sign, the endocrine system, the um, so, and it's not necessarily that buying something more expensive would solve the problem, because that something might not be, even if it's marketed as organic, it might not be organic, or other issues. Here we see, for example, with the eggs, how even the organic eggs or the freedom eggs don't actually have that orange reddish center. So some say, oh, we shouldn't eat animals at all. Fantastic. For that, we need a soil that is rich with minerals. Um, and for that, we need to honor the feminine, whether it's boys, fathers and sons, men and women and daughters, and so on, or people with themselves. And I think we all have, yeah, it's kind of like all of us have healing to do there. Um, so Pluto retrograde on degree 4. Degree 4 is degree of foundation. Saturn in Aries, middle decan of Aries. Mars at the end decan of Taurus. This day was challenging. Okay, Mars in Taurus is slow. It's in its detriment. It's um, and can be how should I say? With Taurus, there's a lot of people who say, oh, there's people tend to stick with what is comfort, but this is actually an understanding that if we have a magnitude 9 earthquake, then perhaps trying to change our dietary options at the same exact time might be overwhelming on the system. For me, for example, I had the first coffee was normal, and then I was like trying to have that oats milk, and then thinking, well, both milk and oats are inflammatory. The latter option is supposed to be like less harmful, although nothing can actually assure that, and ended up recording and drinking 2 cups of coffee when I'm sick, not really having vegetables, and coming back home. Um, and that slowing down of our mental faculties that's needed. I cannot, I'm recording. Um, um, אני לא יכולה עכשיו, אני מקליטה. Now, Moon Mars can also be kind of an emotional overwhelm related friction, and both Saturn and Mars want to set boundaries, but nothing can violate the beta per se appeasing, even in the later degrees. And beta per se appeasing is basically not in spirit, not in matter, allowing rapey dynamics to dictate the passage from Taurus to Gemini. Now with Gemini we have Alcyone. In the female story, the girl was turned into a dove. In the male story, the man loved unconditionally, even though he was born kind of like a dragon, then loved unconditionally, he was turning into the most beautiful man. Then there was having to choose between a woman that wants power and a woman that actually loves him. Um, Both very unrealistic, very mythical, very unrealistic. If the girl was turned into a dove, why do we expect the man to be able to have actual love with either of these women? Where was the girl to be loved unconditionally? Um, Chiron Taurus will ask abundance of such questions. And we can think about the father wanting to have a boy and ending up with a girl that is a tomboy, or um, something that kind of capitalizes on this sun Neptune. But we can also think about the slowness of Taurus that is inherent to something that is a fixed Earth. It's kind of like it's a feature, not a bug, just that different planets experience that differently. And when we bring Chiron there, then we have a 9 magnitude. I also saw regarding Venezuela that they were trying to combine the 7.2 and 7.5 magnituda into 7.8 magnitude and call it one earthquake. Again, classifying changes in the classification of how they define earthquakes, the numerics, the details around those classifications. So one would say, what's the difference? It's like it was horrible either way. Why do we want to look at it in that way or in that way? As or on the other way, we could look at it as, yeah, that did not feel like a 7.5. And to people that it sounds like, oh, what's the difference? Just a couple of things around the point. Those couple of things can be whether the Empire State Building collapses or not. Okay, depending on, I don't even know if it collapsed or is it an existing building. And, he had a couple of, I saw a video with Venezuela. There's a couple of seconds between the people that left the building first and those that tried to leave after the wall collapsed. It's like it's just 1 second. That second matters. And that is, I'm reminded again that when the war with Iran began, we got a very weird notice, and it was about an earthquake, and I ran barefoot to the entry of the house. um, in the open air. That was, I did not even remember if that's a good thing to do in earthquakes. um, so, but it's like, oh, it's underneath the building, and then it's like closest to the ground, so it's not, and maybe it's not good, or but in any case, that they told us that it was an earthquake when in fact it was a missile alert. I did not get all the way to the shelter, and nobody knew what was happening until we got notified that it wasn't an earthquake, it was a political earthquake, but not a physical one. By the way, there was an earthquake as well. We did not get any notices for that. I just lay in bed, and then I thought it's one more of those weird occult stuff that happened. And then that was the ground. So good thing we're past the Sun square Neptune. Sun will agree with Neptune from Leo. Sun is, and we also passed the Sun in conjunction of Pluto. Pluto 4 degrees, again, degree of foundation. Saturn in Aries asks Saturn everywhere asks, where do we put the boundaries so something can grow? Saturn in Aries asks, where do we put the restriction so new things can actually have a solid foundation? For example, one important restriction is that no matter what, people will not be subjected to fear of being violated as a foundation for economy that yields and working conditions that can actually breed 401ks rather than what we have today. Uranus trines Pluto. And then, of course, those that were trying to bank in or cash in on the violation of boundaries, how should I say that? If they're let's say, if they're young people and their closed money is dependent on that, they're banking into a retirement where in the 2060s, which is 28 years from now, we're gonna have the Saturn Neptune conjunction in the middle decan of Gemini, and that's literally it can literally be kind of like a twin towers collapsing with all of the investment popping bubbles. Um, and none of these people will be able to claim that they worked hard and saved. And why is this happening when um, and for people to even have a working sector that yields, it basically cannot be designed on sexual boundary violation or bullying or harassing or any of that sort. The way that the method that people used to deal with that were like, yeah, of course, in that industry, which then it permeated all industries, or oh, people need rehabilitation, they need to get a job, they need to do this, which is like, absolutely not. That's the worst thing possible, and risky even when the person is pushing for that. Um, and this is something that brings us to questions of competence, questions of even a father or man being seen as the provider. What happens when that father was violated as a child? What happens when the onset happens of him finding out about it was is when he's already a father? Um, what happens when the wife that we would think, oh, she could support him emotionally through that, realizes that she was also violated as a child? Okay, that is um, and what happens when a, how should I say that, a person was violated and people try to hold them accountable for being violated by them. Okay, again, I'm not saying that those things are happening right now, but those are definitely the issues of also Sun Neptune. And the challenging reality that is not solved by people getting a job or by people, um, like I said, around the subprime crisis. I had the jobbiest of jobs, high tech company that is befriending a weapon company. I was not doing the weapon stuff. Life insurance covering suicide that only needed to wait for 6 months, and I was fired before the 6 months. Um, and even trying to take responsibility, having my coffee or even dinner so that my parent won't have to eat. And of course, in those times, just when the person was, let's say, relying on the subprime to provide, let's say, for rent, then I lose the ability to work while while there's somebody is actually becoming dependent on me being able to work. And I realize that, wait a second, I'm just a person like with one parent that is not even like a child that needs diapers or anything like that, is not smoking, not drinking. Why doesn't my salary in a high-tech company does the deed of actually providing? Oh well, Epstein files. I did not know what was Epstein files back then. I was angry at women. Why don't they stand up for themselves and for their salaries? And they were like, The husband bring the money, and the one woman that was the main breadwinner was actually taking the breaks, and the entire workplace was revolutionized. But it was the woman that was the main breadwinner. It was, it had a condition where that woman could relate to this, whereas women that would have their salary buying the food probably would bring better vegetables than my humble um, attempts to do with 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 what I can without being able to work, because of issues that had to do with the infiltration of Epstein files to the working sectors in such a way that made either the work unyielding, the work impossible, and the rehabilitation is only to abolish those practices. Now, Pluto retrograded at the degree of foundations, really accentuates on that core, reminds us what happened when Saturn was there, what happened when Uranus was there, what happened when Neptune was there. Um, Saturn in Aries reminds us that it's not about, if you want to put the same brick on the same land, something must have happened. Like, you better make sure that you took other steps, or that other steps were there, that they were not doing the exact same things as we did in the past, or even 28 years ago, if we want the foundation to stand the test of time. We want the cornerstone to actually hold the structure, the building, or what we are building there in Aries. For example, people around the subprime, I was trying to deposit my first um, closed saving, and then the money wasn't money anymore. And then when somebody has to write checks for rent, um, and then, when the parents is probably overwhelmed, they said, "Hey, I don't think that these things have a cover," and it doesn't sound reasonable because you're working in a high tech company. And they're like, "But what are we gonna do?" And so on. No, no, no. I need the da 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 da. And it was like, they're not even seeing through to anything. They're like, "Well, I hope the bank will accept it. I mean, it's rent," and they accept it for 1 month. There were fathers that killed themselves, their family, and their spouses so that they won't be trafficked under those circumstances. I did not even have the means to have an ethical self-death or euthanasia because my insurance wasn't covering for that. My insurance wouldn't even be on at the onset of the life insurance covering for that. So there's no point to try to go to work if all of that happened due to the infiltration of the Epstein dossiers to the economy. There's no point to try to do the same thing, which resulted in me working in the best job I could get without a proper education, not having even the electricity bill paid, the checks returning for literally the rent, and a person that absolutely was not dependent on me becoming dependent on me just when I could no longer make a living. I mean, all the responsibilities, covering my parent with life insurance that covers suicide, and I absolutely checked for suicide. It was very clear that that was the objective with the insurance. And also realizing that that would be the best way that I could take care of my parent financially. Um, there's no point to try to do the same series of steps and expect things to be different when people are still threatened in the workplaces, in their houses, in their environments, and so on and so forth. Particularly not when a person falls or falters and the whatever medical care is offered is making the situation worse, which can spark violence. That isn't there when those threats don't exist, and when the brain is not receiving stuff that blocks absorption of minerals. That leaves beyond reasonable doubt a market sector that can only be explained by, hey, those type of, yes, don't work, they don't yield, they don't actually do anything but creating bubbles and making everyone expandable. Now, with Chiron in Taurus, we definitely see the most fixed things. We think about tomatoes and cucumbers. Okay, kind of like the most basic type of greenery is not even suffice for the people that have, I don't know, iron issues, or what happens when the herbs of the field dry in the summer. Now, um, and of course the square to Pluto, where Pluto here tries to tackle the core issues around foundations, tries to build the cornerstone that stands the test of time. But we have this Chiron in Taurus. For example, a cornerstone that stands the test of time could have been, for example, planting tomatoes or planting, but then for that, people to need to have a plot of land. This is also Chiron Taurus. Also, literally means that women are not comforting. Okay, it can also mean that the woman had to be her own man. The woman had to be her own provider, and so to relax into the feminine, she really needs a man. She needs a man who is even better at providing for her than she is. Not just on a material level that wouldn't make her either dependent on him or him dependent on her, but also on an ethereal, esoteric, okay, mainly not violating those boundaries, and an emotional level. And then what happens when a man can't provide it? Well, he better not try to seek that comfort from the woman that is wounded, because that can be terribly devastating for men. And definitely not be taking his frustration because it doesn't solve anything, and it creates issues for that man to basically be appreciated, be um, loved, appreciated, honored, respected, all the things that he has to do with his own feminine and with women. And it also addresses of women to women, like the notion, this is also definitely a wound around sisterhood, particularly because women that didn't ask for enough for themselves could be compromising them could be compromising things that they might not even be aware of, and then they don't understand the women um, that are not compromising those things. Let's say a woman that was taught to, and it may have been taught good things like to keep the posture upright, or to relax and have a good composure, but also to kiss without actually feeling something in order to just cross the threshold to date with a man. Upper lips, lower lips, yeast, fifth vital sign, endocrine system, cancer, neurodegenerative diseases, to the degree that that was practiced. And then eventually the only thing that would be like, oh, they found a person, they were happy with them, they had children with them, fantastic. The only thing that was an issue, that person was not physically, emotionally, it's like there could be a good provider, but it would not never hug. Now we can see how the onset of compromising that physical embodiment was causing a certain dynamic where either it attracted a similar person, or even in a person that doesn't have these issues, they could have felt a weird rejection when somebody is intimate with them, which could make it difficult for them to hug, for example. It could make something weird about intimacy. And those things usually stay hidden, not bespoken, and so on. Now, let's say that person is um, a life coach or a social worker, or then they could be at odds when there's a woman that stays single because she wouldn't cross that threshold that is expected in society. Or when people think, oh, when a person is single for at a certain age, there must be a problem. And well, that's definitely not necessarily true or untrue. Sometimes they're single because they said no to what the rest of society didn't say no to. Um, and while it doesn't negate that the fact that there can be issues or whatnot, it can simply mean that that in itself was not a litmus test, but it could even have been that a person um, was in a place where they exercise the will, the access to will that they do have, um, whereas other people have to confront with perhaps the limited access to exerting their own will, or the places where their own will was not exercised because of that limited access. And that can be not necessarily because they didn't ask for more for themselves, but it can be pointing to an issue that perhaps because of a societal issue was um, dissociated from, or um, yes, or something along these lines.